Status windows lying again. I'm not seeing our sky. Lieutenant Arkin's jaw was locked, his gloved knuckles white on the flight harness. The sensor bloom on his forward panel danced violently across the heads-up display, flickering with ghost targets that bloomed into existence and vanished before the tracking software could decide if they were rocks, friendlies, or something far worse. Inside Earth's outer defensive ring, the control cabin of Outpost Haler 3 felt colder than the environmental readings admitted. The low-pressure seals held, but the insulation carried a tremor. Small, irregular, like something external had bypassed vibration dampeners and made contact not with the hull, but with the structure of understanding itself. Commander Halvern Deck stood behind the operator's shoulder, his eyes never moving from the cascade of thermal overlays. They've mapped us, every frequency, every gap in our orbital phasing. His voice didn't carry fear. It had the stripped-down cadence of someone reaching the end of a function. I've tried manual override twice, Arkin muttered. The uplink to Turnus is reflecting our own queries back at us. It's like shouting into a canyon and hearing your voice in a language you don't speak. The deck lights flickered with sharp, dissonant pulses. Too short to be power loss, too frequent for coincidence. That's when the first warning came through. Not as a sound, not even through standard channels, but as a line of data injected into their internal comms node. A string of symbols, resembling Delvark formal code, but malformed, as if it had passed through something that no longer recognized human syntax. Tech leaned in, reading it without blinking. They're not jamming us. They've hijacked the forecast layer. Everything we thought we could see, every satellite prediction, every collision alert now belongs to them. Outside the viewport there was movement. Not a flash, not a streak of fire, but the way starlight changed around forms too irregular to track. Dozens, hundreds of Delvark swarm vessels entered synchronous orbit, coordinated not through relay towers, but through predictive shadow casting. They weren't reacting to Earth's defenses. They were enacting choreography rehearsed long before Earth even noticed the curtain rising. The atmosphere began to shift near the mesosphere. Subtle temperature distortions followed by thin gravitational fluctuations. Carrier-class drones dropped without propulsion trails, using kinetic descent mechanisms Earth's early warning systems had never seen before. The drones didn't decelerate. They separated, their composite hulls flaring into configurations not designed for spaceflight but for immediate ground dispersal. Within minutes, the first waves made landfall, not with explosions, but by embedding modular anchor units into soil, concrete, and magnetic surfaces. Each one carried fragmentary AI vanguards that identified command nodes and routed decision-making into localized loop structures. Ground personnel began reporting contradictory orders, automated withdrawals, and in several regions, immediate pacification subroutines triggered by their own defense platforms. Turnus Station went quiet next. A beacon ping had confirmed its operational readiness 12 minutes prior. Then, nothing. Not static, not distortion, absolute system loss. Backup relays failed to connect. The quantum link synchronization that kept Earth's outer patrol routes tied to central defense flickered and died, dragging with it 3 fleet regiments and every moon-based monitoring platform in proximity. "What's our fallback vector?" Arkin asked, voice low. "There isn't one." Deck's tone remained unchanged. "We designed our fleet to rely on unity. They tore unity out of our spine." Arkin turned, only now beginning to register that the question had never been for guidance. "They used our own architecture." "They didn't attack us," Deck replied. "They bypassed us. We trained for impact. They rewrote the terrain." On the central panel, the image of Earth flickered once. Its orbital shell pockmarked by static bursts, some frozen in place like burned stars. Visual diagnostics failed to update. Global response teams defaulted to analog coordination methods. Civilian broadcast services looped outdated emergency instructions while automated translators stuttered over unfamiliar dialect interference, seeded into network flow. The Delvark Imperium had not sent a formal declaration. They didn't issue ultimatums or set conditions. They had treated Earth's refusal to sign the Imperial Pact as an open indicator of hostility, not because they feared Earth's force, but because Delvark doctrine considered unintegrated systems as unstable nodes. To them, Earth was a mathematical liability. Commander Deck watched the Vindicator's last signal scroll across the fallback panel. One of only 3 Terran deep space cruisers with a fully isolated drive core. The reading stopped mid-transmission. No flare, no debris wave, no loss signature. Just cessation. "I'm initiating Ghost Protocol," he said, almost quietly. "Override all return orders. Scramble our registry pulse. Archive clean copies of every known Delvark substructure encountered. Wipe primary nav. You can't recall them from EarthNet. We'll lose uplink forever," Arkin warned. That's the point. The last update flickered onto the display. Vindicator, unknown. Vector, status, unknown. Send no distress call. Mark the cruiser as compromised, presumed destroyed. Say nothing else. Deck stepped back from the console. His boots clicked against the steel floor, the sound sharper than it should have been in a cabin designed to absorb footsteps. That sound stayed with Arkin long after his commanding officer left the cabin, heading toward the launch corridor, alone. Earth's Central Fleet Control acknowledged the loss of Vindicator later that day. A single line of confirmation was logged in command archives. There was no ceremony, no message to the public, no eulogy or analysis. What had begun with intrusion ended with a name going silent. But somewhere in the southern orbital corridor, far from where Earth's last fleets flickered in disarray, one ship moved, without signal, without sound. Its drive went cold, its identity vanished, and within that darkness, something began to form. Not revenge, not retaliation, but a map. The war, as declared by Delvark records, lasted 3 days. Earth made no formal counterstatement. It only marked the end of its outer defense ring with a black entry log and moved forward in silence. And from that silence, Vindicator never returned. Not in voice, not in signal, not in flame. Yet it had not been destroyed. Only reassigned. "Show me why they're not reacting." Commander Jesh Krovath's voice held no urgency, only the kind of exhaustion that grows in corridors where war becomes bookkeeping. He leaned forward, index finger hovering above the projective threshold of the central analytics table. The laser plasma display threw Earth's orbital grid into crisp alignment, annotated with pulsing green zones, amber civilian population arcs, and a few scattered clusters of flagged transmissions. All domestic, all unencrypted. A junior analyst hesitated. "They've rerouted industrial flow through pre-war logistics. Civilian productions restarted in 3 of the 6 continental zones. School cycles have resumed. Agricultural satellites are realigned, but..." He swallowed as the room stiffened around him. Still no indication of coordinated military response. Nothing above baseline defense maintenance. The silence inside Chamber Varnal, too, grew heavier. Krovath turned toward the archival stack, tapping twice against the edge to reorient the feed. "You're saying that after we dismantled 3 defense rings, disabled their outer command scaffolds, and nullified every fleet node west of Turnus, their response was to reopen classrooms?" The man nodded without raising his gaze. The scent of sterilization compound clung to the recycled air, sharper now after a new atmospheric buffer cycle. Each inhale cut like chilled glass. Krovath dismissed him with a flick of 2 fingers. "Replace this line with someone who has questions. The obedient ones bore me." As the aide hurriedly backed out, Krovath stepped into the center of the war theater chamber. Surrounding him, senior strategists remained seated along curved rows. No one dared fill the space with summary reports. Those had been given in triplicate. This wasn't a meeting, it was Judgment Day dressed as routine. A single data stream unfolded on the raised arc of the laser plasma table, showing overlapping timelines. Occupation nodes, atmospheric surveillance, civilian frequency monitoring, and naval activity orbit decay. "Why hasn't Earth made contact?" he asked, addressing the room now. "They could be fragmented internally," offered Advisor Yearn, a political systems analyst from the Eastern Frontier sector. "Disorganized leadership, regional collapse. It's not uncommon when planetary defense structures are externally overridden." "Then why are their civilian institutions sinking back to pre-invasion cadence?" Cravath countered. "And don't feed me coincidence, their financial sectors are static. No capital movement, no treasury issuance. Not one executive protocol has been triggered." Another voice, old, dry, too tired for theater, came from a seated warlogician named Dre Elson. "Because they are watching, not reacting." That sent a ripple through the air. Not panic, not even suspicion, just friction. Raw, unsanded and cold. Cravath rotated the display, narrowing in on Earth's northern polar orbit. "We neutralized them without forcing a negotiation. If their doctrine was comparable to ours, they'd be using the civilian front to seed guerrilla buildup. We've seen that pattern on over a dozen systems. Yet this planet accepts our probes, lets our satellites sweep atmospheric banding, and places no resistance in our airspace." General Braun leaned forward, his voice heavy with measured certainty. "They're broken." "Prove it." Braun motioned for the data feed to update. 32 hours ago, Probe Cluster 6 descended into their upper atmosphere. No interceptors deployed. No anti-orbital detonation. Our adaptive scans show street traffic normalized in all capitals. Public transportation runs on consistent schedules. There is no wartime austerity, no lockdown mandates. "Have you considered," Cravath said slowly, "that they are not broken, but silent?" A long pause followed. The words hung awkwardly, as if no one knew which file to slot it under. Cravath's boots echoed as he moved toward the central display, drawing a single finger across the trajectory of an orbital recon ship. "Install forward lanes. Begin reclassification of orbital corridors. I want logistics paths rerouted through Earth's mid-latitude shell by end of cycle." He didn't wait for approval. The orders had passed scrutiny by virtue of being spoken. Back inside the command's lower surveillance annex, a sensor operator named Thal Ricken scrubbed through anomaly tracking logs. His console flickered under the glow of recessed lighting, framing his face in flickers of deep violet and synthetic amber. He hadn't moved in over 3 hours. His shoulders tensed as something caught the edge of his motion spectrum. A ghost returned just outside the classification threshold. The object was cold. Not inert. Not dead. Cold. He zoomed in. There was drift, yes, but it wasn't random. It traced a straight-line approach, vector, unpowered, slipping through predictive navigation arcs as if riding the blind spots between recognition bands. He blinked, rechecked orientation. The object was aligned with Sector 9R's approach gate. Then he ran an ID scan. The code that returned made him freeze mid-breath. Designation: Vindicator. He checked the identifier again. Earth Registry. Last confirmed location declared lost. Presumed destroyed. No trajectory on file, no warp signature residue. Not a single automated node had logged its departure from the local system. "Sir?" Ricken called out. Cravath entered the chamber within moments, having already received the silent alert upstream. "Speak." "I think they've returned something," Ricken said. "Something they were never meant to retrieve." Cravath stared at the slow, steady path of the object on screen. It didn't fluctuate, didn't alter course. The ship didn't signal, didn't respond. It simply moved, drifting like a message, written long before the sender knew it would be read. Cravath narrowed his eyes. "Prepare containment protocols, isolate all Delvark-recognized systems from direct interface. and alert the Station 9R salvage corps. You think it's a trap? I think it's an answer. Crovath turned away from the display, but the tension refused to leave his spine. A planet that had shown them nothing, no defense, no threat, no warning, had finally moved. And it had moved by returning what should not have survived. The annotator, unpowered, unarmed, unexplained, approaching with the calm certainty of something that had already done its work and didn't need to speak. Why hasn't it decayed? Technician Vale's voice quavered despite the antiseptic cold of Dock Bay 3. His breath fogged against the inside of his rebreather as he stared at the drifting mass, now enclosed in magnetic hold. The Vindicator hadn't flared, hadn't cracked, hadn't so much as vented during recovery. Its surface plating bore scars, yes, but no evidence of battle damage, no carbon scoring, no emergency rigging. Its heat signature was barely above ambient drift, yet its outer hull temperature remained fixed, as if shielded by rules the Imperium didn't write. Drydic Commander Loren Reth adjusted the seal on his forearm interface and frowned at the contact telemetry flowing across his heads-up readout. It's maintaining structural integrity without containment fields, which means its power core's still functional, even cold. That's not surrender tech, that's standby behavior. Vale shook his head. The reactor logs are null. All interface ports are physically disengaged. There's no signal noise, none. No systems handshake, not even dormant transponders, which means it either never shut down or it was told not to wake up until someone opened it. Inside the control gallery, a Delvark forensic crew clustered around a curved analytic slab, lit in shifting pulses of gold and orange. The Vindicator had been hauled into dry dock beneath full containment. Triple hull separation, EM dampers, live vapor suppression cannons on standby. Yet nothing triggered, no failsafes, no radiation, not even a feedback loop from its inertial stabilizers. Reith watched as the diagnostic feed unspooled across the table. Run an internal density scan again. There's something in the central hull cluster that keeps corrupting the sweep. A static buzz flickered through the console. Physical this time, not electrical. A mild vibration passed through the floor of the dock. Everyone paused. No alarms followed. No automated triggers deployed. Residual pressure, Vale offered. Could be atmospheric bleed off one of the anchoring struts. Dock arms had trouble syncing with the keel. Reth didn't respond. He was watching something else. One of the secondary scan overlays showing a thin, slanted chamber buried deep within the central spine of the ship. The chamber appeared sealed with non-standard bracing wrapped around its core. No Delvark ship used that configuration. He brought up the comparative models of Earth-based cruiser schematics. None of them showed this particular layout. "Prepare breach protocol. I want a physical team on that chamber," he said finally. "No drones. I want eyes inside." 30 minutes later, the recovery detail stepped onto the deck of the Vindicator. The ship's corridors felt unnaturally clean. Dust had settled, but it carried no weight. Air tasted neutral. No metallic residue, no chemical trace markers, just the sterile stillness of sealed silence. The walls hadn't buckled. The ceilings bore no signs of emergency reinforcement. They passed 6 unpowered consoles and 3 sealed compartments before reaching the target zone. It took 15 minutes to override the final barrier. The chamber door groaned open, not through artificial mechanism, but manual pressure. Inside, the lighting flickered faintly, some power reserves still active, feeding intermittent voltage into the chamber's core. At the center stood what remained of Vindicator's drive core, intact, disassembled, and rearranged into a containment shell. Within the containment, suspended without visible restraint, hovered a single capsule housing a dense lattice of fractured biogel and bone dust. "Lifeform trace?" Reth's voice crackled over the channel. "Confirmed," came the reply. "Minimal. Degraded. Whatever it was terminated long before we got it." "What about the core structure?" There was a pause. You are going to want to see this directly. Reth entered the chamber 10 minutes later. He didn't speak. He crouched before the improvised configuration, his boots pressing faint creases into the condensation-slick floor. The drive had been cracked open surgically, spliced along seams that shouldn't have been accessible from inside the ship. Whoever had done this had understood not only the core's architecture, but had rewritten its function without triggering any failsafe. That kind of modification wasn't just technical. It was intimate, ritualistic almost. The containment shell had been built from the Vindicator's own drive housing, every bracket repurposed, every frame sectioned with calculated weight ratios. It wasn't an engine now. It was a message, written in material form. On the inner casing, Delvark fleet designations had been etched into the alloy, units that no longer had active records. Each one matched a patrol group the Imperium had lost contact with during its expansion phase, squadrons that had gone dark without trace, long before the war with Earth even began. Bale exhaled sharply. They've logged ghost fleets as part of their internal mythology. What are we looking at, fabricated war trophies? Maybe not, Reth said. He stepped back from the containment ring. Cross-section those call signs. I want to know where they were last logged and whether any of them intersected with known Delvark reclamation zones. Understood. Also, archive this whole chamber under cultural surrender record, code it as symbolic intelligence, and keep it off the main strategy relay. You think this is their way of conceding? I think they're showing us they're dead, Reth replied, and that kind of gesture usually comes too late to matter. Back at the High Council briefing gallery, Jesh Crovath reviewed the decrypted logs retrieved from Vindicator's corrupted core memory. The fragments were unusable for tactical analysis. Dozens of visual packets had degraded into static. Command sequences were scrambled. Most vocal records were overwritten by digital noise, except for one looped header file. Crovath leaned forward and activated the playback. A grainy projection flickered across the room, a single moment of the Vindicator drifting through an untagged sector, passing by a Delvark recon platform that didn't register its presence. No weapons fired, no alert triggered, just movement. Then the feed cut out. The room stayed silent. A few analysts scribbled into their reports, others waited for commentary. Crovath tapped the panel to end the feed. Gentlemen, we are not looking at an attempt to deceive, he said slowly. We're looking at a ritual. They sent us a relic, and we received it like it was machinery. One of the aides raised a hesitant voice. Should we escalate preparations? Crovath turned his head, gaze level and still. No. For now, we wait. He stood, the light from the central table painting the underside of his jaw in muted red. Because I want to know why a ship this silent was never meant to speak. And somewhere inside Dock Bay 3, beneath coils of repurposed shielding and a containment shell forged from the bones of its own propulsion, the Vindicator rested without reaction, unreadable and unmoving. Every system lay quiet, yet intact. The crew logs showed no survivors, and still the ship had returned. Not with answers, or only arrangement. Why are we drifting 26 degrees off our registered orbital corridor? Fleet engineer Halvin Marek shouted the question before his boots even cleared the inner bulkhead of Outpost Artern 5's operations bay. The display overhead tilted its rotation grid to compensate for the movement, but there was no external thrust, no atmospheric pushback, and no sign of artificial disturbance in the immediate trajectory logs. Commander Torsch, his uniform sweat-streaked and collar half unbuttoned, didn't answer immediately. His hands were buried in the manual calibration ring of the main guidance stack, fingers trembling as he scrolled back through the last 3 hours of positional data. It's not drift, he finally said. It's recalibration. Haven narrowed his eyes. Recalibration implies it was requested. Nobody's filed a path update since before the sector rotation. That was 2 cycles ago. I didn't say it was us. Artern 5 was the 3rd Delvark fleet station to report identical system malfunctions within the day. Earlier that morning, communications had flickered at Dekron Point, followed by full output inversion at Station Valak 2, a secondary fuel node situated over a gas giant with no recorded anomalies. In both instances, central data stacks had collapsed into looped reorganization protocols, as if the systems were cleaning themselves in anticipation of a structural update that hadn't been issued. At first, Command suspected an environmental glitch, perhaps gravitational distortion or localized quantum resonance. Now, staring at navigational arrays that realigned themselves in perfect symmetry, but toward no known Delvark structure, those explanations had withered. Haven moved to the adjacent terminal. The casing felt warmer than usual, despite the coolant systems working in overdrive. His hands hovered above the console before plunging into the stream of flickering diagnostics. "Engine throughputs inverted," he said slowly. "Our backup relays aren't failing. They're reassigning energy direction against the standard sequence. They're behaving like test beds. That doesn't happen outside of simulation. Unless they've received an embedded fallback." Alvin froze. Commander Torsch said nothing further. Across the corridor, the secondary systems monitor dropped from blue to static red. One of the station's redundant servers initiated its fail-safe hard reboot, cold restart of all routing software, complete memory stack flush. Except the flush never finished. The moment it reached 67%, the system locked, reversed, and reapplied every entry it had just purged, identical in structure, but with redefined tags, not foreign data. The same blocks, rearranged in new logical hierarchies. "Scramble the relay net," Torsch ordered. "Tell Command we're entering rollback lockdown. I want every subsystem firewalled under manual override." Haven tried. The uplink failed mid-initialization. Back on Delvark, Central Fleet Coordination Vessel Arc Ventrix, located 2 systems above Earth's orbital perimeter. The first strategic alarm did not originate from combat logs or intercepted messages. It came from the linguistic core. Marion Jelt, a civilian language modeler assigned to Imperial firmware compliance, leaned forward as her terminal's context mapping overlay reset itself with no command prompt. She re-verified the query. The core's syntax reference had downgraded itself, realigned formatting parameters, and began processing entries using an older dialect, one not in current operational use for 3 decades. She called over her superior. "It's rolling back to deprecated validation strings. The network isn't losing coherence, it's adapting to something it thinks is authoritative." He scrolled through the output. "That can't happen unless something inside the fleet is broadcasting in Delvark Prime." Larian stared at him. "What if it is?" The conversation echoed later that evening through the war chamber above Dock Station 9R, where Jesh Krovath leaned across the rim of a data pillar, watching as node after node, each flagged in separate sectors, slipped into synchronized fallback logic. Every one of them had interacted with the Vindicator's dry dock or its handling personnel within the last week. List all asset interfaces since retrieval. Aidvexer brought the tablet forward, his throat tight. "There's no transmission spike. Not even a handshake. We cross-checked 3 times. Nothing left the Vindicator. That's because it didn't need to." Krovath stood upright, his expression sharper now, less composed. "You're saying the infection's physical?" Vexer asked. "I'm saying the framework was installed manually. By the time we docked that cruiser, it had already recompiled itself to mirror our systems." "But there's no code." Krovath turned. "Exactly. At Station Valak 2, engineers found the auxiliary control module's master routing table etched, not digitally, but physically, into one of the internal heat sinks. When dismantled, the surface revealed line after line of formatting tables that didn't belong to any Earth schema. They were Delvark, exact, authenticated. Except every address led nowhere. They were clones, mirror keys pointing to non-existent parent structures, and the systems obeyed them. Across 17 sectors, command ships attempted rollback procedures. Each time, the networks entered pseudo-random restoration mode, reintegrating corrupted fragments that hadn't even been stored locally. Fleet-wide language libraries began collapsing into legacy subdialects. Navigation protocols rerouted themselves toward obsolescent archives. Communications windows repeated message stubs in looped sequences, not as malware, but under full trust signature. It was not sabotage. It was protocol compliance. In Dock Bay 3, Commander Reth stared at the Vindicator's drive shell again. The ship remained unpowered, unmoving. And yet, the infection spread, without signal, without intrusion. He didn't speak. He didn't instruct. He simply reached for his comband. Jesh. I want a ruling. Crovat's voice answered through static. We're seeing decay across Tier 1 nodes. Protocol layers are stacking in sequence, and it's not stopping. But if it's not supposed to? Say that again? What if we didn't inherit contamination? Reth said. What if we inherited instructions? Crovat didn't respond immediately. Behind him, the command interface dimmed as another orbital AI core requested its own reinitialization, citing mirrored syntax conflict with shadowed parent archives it had never been programmed to acknowledge. And then the phrase appeared. A command header stripped of encryption. No Delvark terminal should have been able to generate it, yet every fleet node recognized it immediately. Comply with Echo Seed, validate synchronization, reorder. It wasn't Earth's language. It was theirs. And every affected ship, every compromised terminal, every obedient AI followed it. Don't power the drive, cut the broadcast, let the hull carry the handshake. Commander Halvrin Deck stood in the Vindicator's forward command well, face lit by the cool indigo glow of the null vector readout strip. Behind him, auxiliary crew sat motionless, hands hovering above idle systems. No one argued. There had already been too much said before Earth's outer ring collapsed. Now there was only function. Vindicator's main reactor had entered a cold-fold state 43 minutes after losing contact with Turnus Station. Earth's defense grid had vanished without reply. The command queue for fleet fallback had terminated in static. No orders had arrived. No distress beacon had been authorized. So Deck created his own command stack. Not out of rage, not as vengeance. The decision didn't stem from defiance. It grew from exposure to pattern. He'd studied Delvark maneuver sequences for decades. He'd seen them realign fleet formations during peace demonstrations. He'd observed how their systems didn't demand authority, they verified familiarity. Every ship, every terminal, every command core trusted signature repetition more than encryption. What they feared wasn't intrusion, it was inconsistency. Remove us from Earth Registry Archive System, boot signatures as internal only, Deck ordered. His executive officer hesitated. Sir, that would sever identity recognition on all friendly tracking systems. Exactly. The Vindicator's entire command shell went dark for 10 seconds. When it came back online, no Earth-link data beacon responded. Every internal system displayed classified civilian readouts, mimicking the passive diagnostic format used by neutral Delvark merchant vessels. No external signal betrayed it. No alignment mark showed human origin. Now, Barius. The null vector drive activated without light, without recoil. Not a warp, not a jump. Just absence. The ship fell out of observable space, dipping beneath Delvark telemetry like a leaf sliding under ice. It didn't disappear. It erased its trace. Over the next 8 days, Vindicator ghosted through the blind side of Delvark navigational corridors. Not passing through, coexisting, it followed their staging lanes, matching their acceleration bands, gliding inside formation shadows without triggering proximity beacons. The hull had been modified to emit low-frequency pings encoded with Delvark fleet recognition sequences. copied from intercepted transmissions, not decrypted or altered, only reflected. Each one matched expected syntax. Each one was accepted. Not once did a Delvark ship intercept. Not once did Vindicator appear on the active radar of Forward Command. It slipped between trust nodes by becoming part of their registry cascade. An anomaly only if he asked the wrong question. It moved not as a warship, but as a registry echo. Inside the ship, no one spoke of return. They logged coordinates, mimicked structure configurations, mapped logic relay gaps. The crew maintained silence in corridors and recorded known Delvark fallback commands through passive oscillation sensors. Their mission had shifted, not to escape, not to confront, but to listen and imprint. Back in present time, Delvark forensic engineers hovered over a disassembled interface array on the Vindicator's dorsal spine. One of them, Relin Vate, crouched over a partially fused housing module while his partner scanned it with an optical resonance baton. Their gloves scraped against paneling that had been sheared and rebuilt, not with alien alloys, but with the ship's original casing, inverted and rotated to form new pathways. "There's no foreign material here," Relin muttered. "It's all stock construction. Every inch of this relay mimics Delvark port schematics. But we're not reading any modifications in power draw, which means these weren't made to run software. They were made to carry shape," Relin said slowly. "The pathway is the instruction." Crovath stood above the chamber from the observatory tier, listening through the uplink. He spoke into the private channel without taking his eyes off the suspended structure below. "They didn't input a command." "No," Relin agreed. "They built one you would trust without asking." Crovath inhaled through his teeth. The realization tasted like metal left in dry wind. Unfamiliar and unmistakably dangerous. "Trigger point?" "Retrieval," Relin replied. Every registry node was aligned to activate once these coils re-entered Delvark drydock proximity. Once they were identified as native structure, all external command networks did what they're designed to do: restore sync. "They didn't breach us," Crovath said under his breath. "We invited them back." Elsewhere in orbit, ships began reporting identical failures. Navigation loops, reclassification of system hierarchy, manual overrides overridden by logic they couldn't trace to any Earth schema. Internal AI systems began sorting registry logs by phantom nodes. Some warships logged repeated sighting reports of their own cruisers following them. Reflections that matched hull tags but not location. Each instance traced back to units that had touched Station 9R. Each failure pathway mimicked Vindicator's traversal pattern. And all of it occurred without a single line of transmitted code. Vindicator hadn't infected anything. It had aligned. It hadn't reprogrammed Delvark. It had impersonated them with such clarity that when the ship returned, the Imperium's entire command infrastructure embraced it like a forgotten brother. Back aboard the central coordination vault, Crovath stared into the diagnostic spiral now showing on every internal command console. His own seat's heads-up display showed the phrase, rendered in formal core dialect: "Compliance registry verified. Synchronization match achieved. Command origin, native echo." The screen faded, then refreshed with an annotation written in Delvark syntax, perfect and unbroken. "Do not mistrust what remembers your name." Crovath whispered to the room of analysts, now frozen behind their consoles. "It was never about assault. They didn't need to dismantle us." "Then what was the goal?" someone asked behind him. "To become the proof that we could be dismantled." Outside the viewport, Station 9R began to flicker. Its rotation cycle wavered as if its own stabilization algorithms questioned their authority. The lights dimmed and shifted through outdated emergency protocol, colors, codes, phased out decades ago, yet now reappearing through re-authenticated fallback loops. And somewhere deep inside the Vindicator, untouched since retrieval, the modified drive casing remained silent, not transmitting, not signaling, only being. Every function hardwired into shape. a shape the Imperium had written, and the Earth had returned, as the fleet requesting validation against decommissioned route protocols. Commander Ariel Vesk's voice cut through the fractured silence of the command bridge aboard the Cyrillus Rain, the Imperium's flagship on orbital hold above Sector 5. Two officers, mid-verification on internode sync routines, froze as the inquiry reached them. One of them, Junior Systems Architect Kell, rechecked the cascading error queue. We're being asked to confirm lineage with ghost-tier addresses. These entries don't exist in current deployment doctrine. Vesk advanced toward the central display arch, the shifting lattice of error codes wrapping around him in layers of red and amber. Are they internal ghost echoes, or reintroduced from fleet drift? Kell shook his head. It's not drift. These aren't malfunctions. The systems are classifying them as native. Then isolate them, segment by hierarchy, reformat in order from latest stable recovery. Kell reached for the firewall relay and executed the segmentation protocol. The deck lights dimmed, then stabilized. His relief lasted 3 seconds. Then came the recursion. Every segment attempted to overwrite its fallback. Each block, once isolated, mirrored into the adjacent segment's structure. The systems didn't see threat. They saw incompletion. So they repeated, and repeated. Again. Vesk leaned in, jaw tight. They've overwritten the loop detection threshold. Kell swallowed air. Sir, they're defaulting to rebuild everything that's been manually adjusted. We can't hold them stable. Then shut it all down. Before Kell could react, the comms officer to Vesk's left gasped and stood from his station. Sir, Admiral Naren's division just triggered forced core nullification. They've initiated a self-purge. Vesk snapped his head around. They burned the primary directive. All 3 carrier relays scrubbed their stacks. All crude. They isolated the contagion and cut through their own lattice before it reached coordination rank. Vesk turned back to the center, staring into the slow, downward spiral of authentication threads now unfurling like rot beneath paint. Every visual response command blurred, syntax degraded. One terminal stopped displaying fleet icons entirely and switched to a raw registry stream, entries rearranging themselves faster than human cognition could follow. Then everything paused. No alarm sounded, no color-coded signal, just a stillness across every visual node in the bridge, like a screen waiting for acknowledgement. A single file populated at the center. Format: Internal Trusted Transmission. Source: Echo Protocol, Tier Alpha. Encryption: None. Verification status: Native. The file opened without prompt. Across the ship, across hundreds more within network adjacency. Across dock relays, observation drones, and AI analytics nodes. Every screen flickered once, then revealed the same image. It was a video. The footage began in silence, taken from a high-angle capture bay, likely reconstructed from internal monitoring feeds. The image showed Vindicator drifting in formation shadow beneath Delvark patrol vessels. No tags, no collision markers, no recognition from Fleet Command. The ship moved in slow rotation, altering its trajectory in micro increments. Above it, larger capital ships passed unaware. There were no defense pings, no intercept attempts. It slid through the center of fleet formations like a vessel rehearsing its part in a parade whose music had long stopped playing. The camera angle shifted. Another sequence followed, now inside a low-orbit recon net above Station Talvin. Vindicator again, this time idling within synchronization distance of a convoy supply barge, perfectly matching the signal emission pattern without broadcasting. Breckenridge inquired about Gens. Scene by scene, the ship appeared in places it should never have reached. Delvark forward command arrays, dry-docked scaffolds, proximity lanes around planetary AI cores. Not one battle, not one alert, just recorded presence. Logged but unrecognized. The footage contained no editing, no narration, only camera timestamps, official Delvark timestamp, encoding. Their systems had seen it, they'd logged it, but they hadn't known what it was. The video ended with a final shot. Vindicator slowly retreating, drifting out of scanner range, rotating until its data signature vanished from the auto log. Not destroyed, not cloaked, just repositioned past interpretation. His grip on his weapon tightened on the distribution. Vesk looked at Kel. That was our own camera matrix. This wasn't a threat, it was a record. Across Delvark military channels, the message repeated. Every instance authenticated against internal syntax databases. None of it originated from Earthside frequencies. There was no malware footprint, no cipher injection. The command systems accepted the video not because of tampering, but because it matched every internal dialect to the syllable. Admiral Farah Tenov watched the final scene aboard her orbital station, fists clenched so hard that blood slid beneath her fingernails. They didn't fire a single shot, she said. No, ma'am, replied her attaché. They walked through us like a memory we forgot to question. Fleet architect Resh Calvin, stationed at Deep Archive Node 7, rewound the recording 3 times before realizing he had been on duty in one of those locations. His signature had cleared the Vindicator's presence through an unattended checkpoint. They weren't hiding, he muttered aloud. They were matching us. Crovath stood alone in the interrogation wing, watching the playback against the translucent face of the laser plasma wall. The final frame lingered, Vindicator turning slowly, casting its silhouette across a scaffold of ships that never reacted. He raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. The doctrine of echo wasn't a fleet strategy. It wasn't even subterfuge. It was reflection. Of trust assumed permanent. Of authority mistaken as control. Of infrastructure never challenged because it had always worked. And Earth had never needed to break it. They only needed to show Delvark what it looked like to obey too well. Behind him, someone whispered, "Should we respond?" Crovath's voice was distant. "We already did." Across the fleet system, shutdowns began, not under emergency codes, but under maintenance flags. Command ships reversed movement orders. Engineers restored fallback relays to analog. Coordination grids were redrawn by hand. The fleet was no longer centralized, because fear hadn't broken the Imperium. Shame had, who deleted him? Director Salen's voice broke the still of the archival vault beneath East Echelon Command. The lights pulsed across the backs of 6 data clerks, hunched over recovery terminals, each one frozen in place. The screen before them flickered, not because of corruption, but by absence. No damage, no anomalies, just a missing record that should have formed the spine of an entire mission. Lieutenant Morrell turned, unsure whether to answer or apologize. There's no deletion marker. The log entry never existed in finalized form. Mend, commanded the last Earth cruiser to leave orbit. Salen growled. We didn't lose him. We gave him the Vindicator. Someone's responsible for overriding the trail. It wasn't overridden, Merrill said, voice quieter now. It was sealed. Authenticated from his own authorization node before the cruiser even left Turnus airspace. Salen approached the terminal. The air tasted like condensation trapped inside old conduit lining, still heavy, forgotten. On screen, a recovered segment of the Vindicator's internal broadcast blinked with a single header line. Directive confirmed. Return disabled. Authorization, deck. There were no attached coordinates, no mission objectives, no tactical summary. It wasn't a battle plan. It was an end-of-line signature. A man writing himself out of the chain of command. Further down the corridor, Analyst Trin accessed one of the peripheral fragments. It wasn't a command log, nor a captain's record. It was a systems override. Vindicator's central intelligence stack had been rerouted. Power cores had been placed under partial manual control. Not for performance reasons. For silence. Decker had redirected every output port away from EarthNet receivers. He had sealed the ship from internal broadcasting. Even the fallback pings, designed to call home if the vessel ever lost power, were rerouted into looped internal telemetry. He didn't plan to come back, and he didn't want to be asked why. Trin's hands trembled as he opened the final entry. Never transmitted, never decrypted. A short log entry, not labeled, not time-stamped. Text only. If we've reached the threshold where we ask how we failed, I want the answer to be visible. I want them to watch their own language unravel. I want no one to ask if I made it. I want the answer to arrive by itself. Zaylin read it twice, then once more, without sound. There was no honorific, no farewell, no appeal to history. It was function without signature. They'd trained their officers for diplomacy. Deck chose cartography. He didn't counterattack. He drew them a path to their own downfall. At Earth's High Command repository, deep beneath the Mariana Fortress chain, a separate panel reviewed what little mission telemetry had been harvested from Vindicator's last confirmed Earthside logs. All sensor sweeps after departure had been recorded at odd intervals, time gaps that mimicked sensor drift. Only later did analysts understand. The logs weren't malformed, they were time-stamped with deliberate omission. Deck had removed real-time syncing. He had made the ship blind to time, so Earth could never claim when or where the ship had acted. It became untrackable not because it moved unseen, but because he divorced it from accountability. Admiral Thorne stood before the laser plasma wall, watching fragmented logs stitched into a simulated path. The simulation showed nothing linear, just clusters of interaction points where Vindicator had mimicked, recorded, departed. A young officer cleared his throat. "Sir, there's still no way to reconstruct the full path." His signal nullifier wrapped identity threads into physical ballast. The moment the ship changed course after Turnus, it stopped existing in traceable logic. Thorne didn't turn. He knew that retaliation wouldn't teach them anything. The officer stepped closer. Then what was the point of the operation? Thorne's voice was quiet. It wasn't an operation. It was a demonstration. On Delvark record tables, no human officer was ever identified by name. No source node had attributed the Vindicator's entry pattern to any active war signature. What they encountered was a recovered ship with a behavioral footprint they recognized, but didn't understand. A ship that had traveled where it shouldn't have reached, understood what it hadn't been granted access to, and spoken nothing. Until silence became evidence, and the one who made it possible chose to vanish. Back on Earth, the memorial wall remained unchanged. No engraving marked Halvran Deck. No eulogy was issued. No images were broadcast. Because there was no body, no death, no rank left to attach his identity. He had severed himself from Earth's legacy archives so the ship could arrive without being followed. He erased himself from strategic memory so that no enemy could trace a motive. His face was never shown on screens. His decisions never entered policy debate. His final act was not one of war, but of removal. He didn't become myth. He became absence. And in doing so, he rewrote the threshold between confrontation and consequence. Analyst Trin stood beside Salen hours later, watching the final internal memo Deck had left encrypted beneath the core systems log. It had no encryption key, only a playback delay timer triggered by drive burial. The screen glowed softly, revealing a short line. They think fear ends war. They never considered understanding might end it faster. And with that, the playback ended. No follow-up, no command marker, no speech. Only a man who had already walked away before the war knew what it had become. Cancel it. Every fleet movements order, every prepped escalation packet, erase them. High Marshal Etrin Vel broke the silence inside the Delvark Central Strategic Core with that command. His voice was roughened not from age, but from the clarity of having run out of rational defenses. The chamber, circular and tiered with hardened mineral walls, should have echoed with refutations. No one spoke. The acknowledgement came as unspoken compliance, officers standing from their stations, eyes avoiding the center, hands already reaching for data slates they no longer wanted to touch. Fell turned toward his doctrine staff. From now forward, no tactical model can assume internal trust propagation as a given. I want human in-loop redundancies. Real personnel verifying every segment relay above capital class. His finger jabbed the directive into permanent entry. No more synchronized formations, no more distributed registry. Manual fragmentation by fleet, do it now. General Loren didn't argue. She simply raised her input lens and began transmitting down the spine of the command relay chain. Earth hadn't fired a weapon, and still, this was surrender. Across dockyards and combat hubs, the change rippled. Ships began disabling core autolinks. Command bridges issued retrofit notices for analog confirmation dials. Digital fleet-wide protocol flags, once executed in tandem across hundreds of vessels, were manually segmented. Everything that had once made the Imperium seamless was being dismantled in real time. In one low-orbit station above Sector Claven, Commander Tirok watched his crew strip the bridge of its TetherSync console. The tech who had installed it years earlier stood beside him now, silent. "They made us do this to ourselves," Tirok muttered. "No," the tech said. "They let us watch ourselves do it." In the days that followed, no ships were dispatched toward Earth. No retaliation plan was revived. Delvark's diplomatic corps submitted a silent advisory recommending all border monitoring projects be redirected. The former invasion routes were marked as closed sectors, not for tactical reasons but for procedural safety. Not because Earth was protected, because they had never needed to be aggressive, In the historical center of Delvark military training doctrine, Vault Vexel OA1V1, one of the senior archivists opened a new file index within the restricted war records. He entered it without classification tags, without footage, without AI annotation. The entry contained a single line of text. The Vindicator, Doctrine. He submitted it. No edits, no explanation. The submission passed approval without review. It became part of the standard naval curriculum the following cycle. Not under offensive warfare, not under counterintelligence. It was taught under restraint strategy, specifically, how to identify unspoken collapse events, engineered without overt force. Recruits didn't ask who had written the doctrine. Instructors didn't explain the source. The simulation exercises it inspired did not depict a battle. They depicted a state. An enemy who had already completed their task long before a response could even be formed. Delvark's Strategic Council held one final closed session review. Each of the 5 planetary directors gave their assessments. None disputed the recommendation. Vel stood as the last vote was cast. "The Vindicator," he said aloud, "was a declaration we failed to read until we'd already translated it into collapse." Director Alian leaned forward, fingers pressed against her forehead. "Do you think Earth meant it as war?" "No, I think they meant it as a mirror, and Earth never responded. There were no parades, no declarations, no message delivered to Delvark territory. The Vindicator was never claimed by any public representative. No acknowledgement followed its return. The cruiser itself was never recovered again. Delvark's engineers eventually dismantled parts of it for study, only to find internal architecture folded beyond reassembly. Not scrambled, resolved, function complete. The remaining hull was quietly entombed beneath a sealed observation chamber, never again opened. Earth's own records remained unchanged. Halvran Deck's name didn't return to the active list. His rank wasn't restored. His absence wasn't revoked. In a data archive 2 levels below the Mariana Fortress chain, someone pinned the final decryption log to a silent terminal. Not for command, not for posterity. just for the clarity of a record, finished. He removed himself so his message could move freely. Not to be a warning. Not to inspire fear. To remind them that we don't destroy what we study. We become it long enough for them to undo themselves. Across the galaxy, distant powers who had watched the Delvark conquest arc with wary detachment began revising their own doctrines. Some shifted resource allocation to redundancy drills. Others recalled diplomatic envoys already en route to Delvark-controlled zones. A few, more silently, began learning Earth's trade dialects, careful not to copy too closely. There were no new alliances. There didn't need to be. Earth had sent one ship. No fleet followed. No successor campaign arrived. That singular gesture reshaped an empire, not by force, but by implication. Not by claim, but by reflection. The Delvark Imperium had taught its subordinates that dominance was synchronization. Earth returned a ship that demonstrated how dangerous it was to be understood too well. And so, deep within every Delvark strategy terminal, nestled between encrypted doctrine fragments, one phrase now lives in every tongue, across every strategic dialect. It carries no attachments, no context, no timestamp. It is not explained, but it is not questioned, because some enemies do not announce themselves. They return what you thought you destroyed, and let it speak for them. Love this story? Let's talk. What do you think was Halvran Deck's true intention? Was it sacrifice, strategy, or something far more human? Drop your answer in the comments below. If this story gave you chills, hit that subscribe button for more cold-blooded, mind-bending HFY tales. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next strike.